Good evening, everyone. I'm Maria Trice Jenkins, and welcome to the Talkback for Before They Die. What a powerful film. What a painfully powerful film. And thank you for joining us. Today on our panel this evening we have Randy Crable, who is a journalist, a writer, and the author of the Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre. And we also have the one and only Gail O'Neill, journalist and host of Collective Knowledge. Thank you both for joining us. But first, I'd like to introduce to you, as a newly minted link of Bergen County Link of New Jersey, our president, the illustrious Tammy King.
Thank you, Link Maria. Thank you for that introduction.
Thank you.
The Bergen County chapter of the Links Incorporated are honored to be the sponsors of tonight's film, Before They Die. Filmmaker Reggie Turner, I found it interesting that he made this film after he heard what happened in Tulsa on May 31st, 1921. It was interesting that it was the best kept secret in America, actually the best kept secret in Tulsa. And so what's important about telling this story is that we should all know, if you're Black, if you're white, doesn't matter what race or religion, you need to know this story. And if you've heard the story before, it's important to be reminded of this story. So one thing for sure is that history sometimes repeats itself. So it's imperative for us as Americans, as humans, and especially to the members of the wonderful organization, the Bergen County Links, and our national organization, the Links Incorporated, and actually our Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, is an honorary member of the Links Incorporated. So it's important for us to make sure that this never, ever happens again in a city in this country. So thank you, Jeremy and the Teaneck Film Festival, for presenting and selecting films that deal with social justice for this film festival this year. And it's very relevant, and there's still much, much work still needed. And with that, thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you so much. Thank you, Randy and Gail. You can unmute yourselves so we can talk some more. But what I'd like to get into and talk about, after viewing such a powerful and painful movie, a documentary about people who really wanted some type of justice after going through one of the most horrific massacres we can imagine. Randy, in writing Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre, tell us about your journey through that experience.
Sure. Well, this, for me, it mostly started at the end of 1999. I was assigned to cover what was then called the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. This was a commission that had been set up by the state to look into what had happened in Tulsa in 1921 and recommend some responses to it. And so at that point, I began doing a lot of reading, a lot of research, talking to a lot of people, went back and read all of the old newspapers that I could find on it, and really tried to immerse myself into 1921 to understand what it was like to live in Tulsa and in the United States at that time, and how this thing happened. And so over time, I really it really came to it got to the point pretty quickly that, for 20 years now, there's not been a day go by that I don't think about this in some way, or I'm not reading about it, or doing some research, or thinking about it. I spent a lot of time in the shower thinking about it, and it really helped me understand people who had different backgrounds than I did. I mean, I grew up on a farm in western Oklahoma, very rural, didn't know very many people different than I was. And, you know, I changed somewhat over time, but this, I really came to understand a lot more about what it's like, but really what it's like to be not only Black in America, what it's like to be a woman in America, it's like to be some other minority in America, and to understand a better the, you know, just basically the advantages that I had for, you know, being a white guy. Taught me a lot about listening. I learned to listen better than I ever had. And so it's, you know, it really has changed me a lot.
I can imagine. Gail, when you watched the movie, what were some of the feelings you had?
Deja vu, Maria. The fact that resentment among white people could be so upset by a break in a paradigm. This is what Isabel Wilkerson writes about in Caste, this caste system in which there is the underclass and the class that's in charge. And should the underclass step out of place? Should a Black man become president of the United States? Should an African-American woman rise to vice presidency? Should an Indian American family have more advanced degrees and more material goods than white Americans? That triggers something in white Americans that is frightening, that I hadn't really contemplated before, really before the rise of Donald Trump, before the rise of birtherism, before the rise of questioning whether or not Barack Obama was an American citizen, whether or not he really graduated from Harvard rather, whether or not he really wrote his memoirs. That was terrifying to me. And so when I watched this movie, I thought, this is a repeat of what happened 99 years ago.
And to live it 100 years later.
100 years later, not only 100 years later, but 100 years later, when people are questioning the news, when people are questioning facts and calling it fake news because it doesn't fit with their understanding of the world.
I think, you know, if I could just say, there was a lot of magical thinking went on in 1921 to construct the society that we lived in there. And we still have it.
So the two different ways of thinking still exist in terms of them imagining white people, imagining Black people, maybe not even as people, but more as children.
You know, Maria, I forget who said it in the film, but there was one scene in which I think it was an attorney, a white woman, questions the motivation. I can't remember if it was male or female, but basically what they say is, maybe it wasn't racism that drove these riots, but envy. But why was there that level of envy? In my mind, there's no question. It's because Black people had more than they were supposed to have. Than what people were told that they were entitled to have and to acquire in life. And so this way of looking at the world through two different perspectives, and unlike Randy walking over to the other side and listening for a change, as opposed to imposing your opinions, how could you ever evolve out of your way of thinking if you do not listen?
And no one's listening now. No one's listening now.
Well, there's, you know, as you point out, there's a lot of talking, not just past each other, but in opposite directions from each other. And so that is one of the things that, you know, is a thread for the past 100 years, is that communications is vital, and it has to be personal relationships. And one of the things that allowed, I shouldn't say allowed, one of the things that I guess you would say allowed the families that were so devastated by the massacre is that some of them had relationships with people in the white community who were willing to help them out. Now, I don't want to diminish what the people of Greenwood did before and after, because it's really quite amazing when you kind of understand or consider the real constraints on their lives, you know, what they could do, where they could go, you know, how much money they could earn, and all of that sort of thing.
But they were able to sustain
Relationships were
themselves.
really important.
Yeah.
Relationships were really important. And the thing is that after the massacre, what happened was that the idea was, the way we solve this is that we move further apart. Get together and try and understand what happened. We push further apart.
Maria, can I ask Randy a question?
Absolutely.
I'm curious about something Tammy said. She describes this massacre as the best kept secret in Tulsa. Was it a best kept secret among African Americans and white Americans?
I think it was kind of a mixed deal. I mean, I had an editor when you know, one time, he's about, I don't know, about 10 or 15 years older than I am. And he'd come to Tulsa when he was in high school in the 60s. And the way he described it, he said it was a little bit like the crazy old aunt in a Faulkner novel. Everybody knew she was up there in the attic, but nobody talked about her. And you know, when working on this, what I discovered is that there were in some families it was well known, and in some families it was not talked about. And I think, especially in the case of the white families, you know, I can't prove this, but what it seemed like was that in sort of working class families, they knew about it. They talked about it. It was among the sort of the silk stocking country club crowd that it was not discussed. And in the black families, I think and there are other people who would know better than I would, but it seems like that just had more to do with the character of the people in the families. You know, you had people like the Williamses who made a point of talking about it, and then you had other people who made a point of not talking about it. But there were a lot of people who didn't know about it, but I don't think that's uncommon. I mean, another thing I learned over time was that this sort of thing has happened in a lot of communities, and the people who live in the communities don't know about it. I work with a guy from Arkansas, and he was asking about it. And I said, well, so what do you know about Elaine, Arkansas? He'd never heard of that. Well, Elaine, Arkansas happened in 1919, and it may have been on the same scale as Tulsa in terms of.
Wow. And what about Rosewood? Were they all happening?
Rosewood is another one. Yeah, Rosewood was in 1923. Rosewood and Elaine were similar in that they were very rural and isolated.
Right.
And so it's really hard to know, you know, there wasn't much outside scrutiny of what went on there. Tulsa was a little bit different because it was in a city, and you know, there were more people around.
Through the reporting a massacre in your book, when you talk about discovering through the articles, they were talking about it in the news in Tulsa during the time it happened.
Oh yeah. It was heavily reported on by the Tulsa papers and nationally.
So nationally, why do you think that it wasn't consistent in terms of our education? And it's something that really kind of, why was it so?
Yeah, well, so this is kind of my theory, and there may be something to it and there may not, but especially when it comes to, I don't know, you know, in Oklahoma, you have a required Oklahoma history class. And I don't know if many states do that or not, but we're required to take Oklahoma history when you're in the 9th grade. You're in the 9th grade. And it's like, and it's a semester. Okay. So traditionally what that class consisted of was I think it grew out of the sort of the state's inferiority complex over the grapes of wrath and the Depression and all this stuff. So the intent was to try and create this sort of a shared narrative that was supposed to make you feel better about, you know, create a sense of place and belonging. So we didn't talk about anything controversial. I mean, not only did we not talk about this, we didn't talk about the Depression, we didn't talk about Woody Guthrie, we didn't talk about some of the things that went on with the Indians, American Indians. We didn't talk about Jim Crow. We didn't talk about any of that stuff. You learned the counties and the county seats, and you learned the governors, and you learned a couple of Indian treaties, and that was pretty much it. And I think that works. I think that works in the broader perspective for, you know, at least into high school with history. The purpose is to create sort of a pride in, you know, in this shared narrative. It's not really intended to encourage critical thinking. And
that mindset is still at play today. Maria, recently, the 1619 Project from the New York Times came under scrutiny from the president, saying we should only teach lessons about history that make people feel proud of America. Well, you know, I would really rather know the truth about who we are so we can avoid making past mistakes and reinforce the things that we did right. But this idea of sticking our head in the sand. And, you know, I just thought, as Randy was speaking just now, I just thought of another parallel between what we see in the film and what's happening today. That scene when the elevator operator, and we don't really know what happened, you know, did a young man trip and fall into her path? Did she make it up? Was she the 1921 version of Amy Cooper who weaponized her color and almost got a black man killed in Central Park, a completely benevolent citizen? I thought about the parallels there as well.
Yeah.
Well, it really just makes you really angry to know that you don't have access to the truth, particularly now. And you really have to fight to find out the truth.
So that's true. But here's what I decided over the years that I try to do is I try not to dwell on the unknowable or the things that are in dispute. I think you know, some of these things are important, but you don't want to create a distraction to what you know to be the truth. And what you know to be the truth is that this entire area was just destroyed in a matter of hours. These people's lives were destroyed, and they were destroyed because you know, there were some people who felt like they had too much independence. You know, that the community had too much independence. That these white guys that did it, they wanted to show they were the boss. And I think we still see that. I mean, not just in matters of race, but in all sorts of things. You know, that's kind of that goes on and on forever. Is that people will try and they'll talk about high ideals, or they'll use patriotism or religion or you name it, whatever.
But they're not talking about the truth.
About is control.
Right, and power.
And power.
Their dominion.
Right.
Yeah.
So Randy, tell us about in June when Trump was going to go to Tulsa to do a rally in pandemic, and what happened and how that was covered.
Well, you know, that was a very tense time, and there were people who were really worried. And I have to say the memory of 1921 came into play there, because there were people in the community who really were. You were talking about repeating history. There were people who were afraid that was going to happen. And, you know, I'd say over the last 10 years or so, there's been a kind of a concerted effort to build up a relationship between the white leadership of the city and some of the African-American leaders, and especially we had a mayor who called them the reverends, and he didn't mean it. He meant it in a good. This was like the religious leaders. So we had several really tense situations in the city involving police shootings or law enforcement shootings, and those relationships had really been tested. So now Trump's coming to town. He's talking about coming on Juneteenth, which has actually been kind of a big deal in Tulsa for quite a while. I'm not sure how that got started, but in terms of why it's a big deal in Tulsa, it's not everywhere. And especially it wasn't everywhere in like the 80s. But, you know, and there was talk of people coming in, you know, from all sides of the spectrum, and they were talking about having 100,000 people there. And there were people who were really terrified. I think I mentioned to you, I think that the Black leaders in Tulsa really did a remarkable job in keeping a lid on things. They organized I mean, one of the things that really made people mad was that the Juneteenth celebration had been canceled because of the epidemic. So what happens is President Trump announces he's coming in and we're going to have 60,000 people here and we're going to pack this arena. Well, you know, that really hacked people off, and who can blame them? And so they hastily organized their own, a new Juneteenth celebration. So they put on their own event about, I don't know, half a mile or so from the arena. They begged people not to go to the arena. I mean, you know, people who were opposed to Trump, they begged them to stay away from the arena, come to our event. We're going to have a good time. I think Al Sharpton came in and spoke. And so they met, and then there weren't nearly as many people show up to see Trump as people had expected. I don't know if you know about this or not, but they got out on Greenwood Avenue the night before Trump was supposed to, he put it off to a day, to June the 20th. So they got out on Greenwood Avenue on that the night before and painted Black Lives Matter on Greenwood Avenue. And so then when Trump came into town, he demanded, the airport is on the northeast side of town, so he wouldn't normally fly over downtown, but he wanted to fly over downtown over the arena so everybody could see him in Air Force One. Yeah. Well, actually what he was flying over was, you know, there was not people standing in line. There weren't that many people. But the thing you could see really clear was the Black Lives Matter sign. So people kind of, and so the sort of the memory of 1921 really, I think, hung over the city in those days, in that time. And it probably it helped keep things from getting out of hand. We had very few arrests. We had very little trouble. And, you know, I have these discussions with people. I did a few stories on Black Lives Matter. And of course, people had to call me and set me straight on what Black Lives Matter is. They're all a bunch of communists and so forth. and I said, well, all I can do is tell you my experience with the people here in Tulsa, and this is what they did. And, you know, I don't know if there's any point to that other than you have to be careful. You know, we tend to stereotype other people by the worst possible example of, you know, if you can think of all white people as crackers or hillbillies, and you can think of all, you know, Black people as, you know, somebody who happens to have a Black Lives Matter shirt on as they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. So anyway, I guess I wandered off into the woods there, and I'm sorry.
Where do we go from here?
I don't know, and it's, you know, it really concerns me, and it's not even so much in terms of race, although that's part of it. It's just in the fact that we don't, you know, we don't communicate. As we were talking earlier, here in Oklahoma, I deal with all kinds of people. I mean, I don't know what it's like there, but, you know, Oklahoma voted 65% for Trump. But on the other hand, we have pockets in Tulsa and Oklahoma City that are pretty liberal. And, but we've got, you know, people are not even on the same planet when it comes to they have alternate, you mentioned alternate realities. We've got some alternate realities in society right now. And we got to figure out a way to, you know, cross the figurative railroad tracks and start talking to each other.
And how do you see listening being a cornerstone, you know, a foundation of all.
Oh,
of
well, right. I mean, yeah, right. I mean, listening is you know, to a certain extent, when you have these conversations, you got to be frank, and you know, it can be delicate. I mean, I try and be honest, but also not, you know, be too brutal about it. But you have to listen to what the person is really saying, because sometimes what a person says they're upset about, and maybe even what they think they're upset about, is not really what they're upset about. And I think there's a lot of that going on in the United States right now. I think there are a lot of people who are angry or upset or worried, and they may think they know what is bothering them, but there's something else going on. You know, it's kind of like if you have a spouse or a friend or something, and things have kind of been building up, and then you have you know, it's the proverbial last straw, and you snap over something that otherwise would be pretty minor. And actually, that's what happened in Tulsa in 1921. You know, there was a tension building, and it snapped over something fairly minor. And I'm afraid, you know, we've kind of reached that. And I think there's all sorts of, you know, you can probably throw the, you know, income inequality fits into that. Some people feel like
the real disparity between power and control in this country has been, you know, a tragic legacy that we've been fighting for a long time.
Well, I think what happens is
prior question, Maria, when you asked what can we do now, I was thinking on the most personal micro level. There are two ways that you can grant people justice for past wrongs. There are reparations, but there's also bearing witness.
Yeah.
Sometimes just allowing people to tell their story. So maybe it's for us to go to our elders and to ask them for their stories and to be patient, as Randy said, as they tell them. And then I had an observation as Randy was speaking, talking about 1921, and there was a very small tipping point. I thought about the photographs they showed of a lynching and how one woman commented on how people brought their children to observe this. Are we any different when CNN shows the execution of a man, all 8 minutes of it, broadcast as if it's 1921 and we're picnicking under a lynching? I think it's offensive that we even show these snuff films almost as entertainment. I refuse to watch them. It's an assault on my dignity. I think it's an assault on the dignity of the person who has passed, and it desensitizes us all.
I think the shock of it, though, has enlisted a lot of people that didn't really know how horrific it was.
Maria, if you don't know that the taking of a life is horrific, I don't know if showing it to you is going to demonstrate that to you. Really, there's a chip that's missing that I don't know.
Well, that's the dilemma we're in. There's a huge chip that's missing with a large portion of people.
Agreed. Yes.
You know, so where do we go with that? Where do we go?
Yeah, well, it's we're all human beings, and in some ways we haven't changed much in a long time.
Oh, this has really been very special. I think we've covered a lot. I've been looking through a lot of the questions in the chats, and we hit a lot of the points. And some of the people were talking about, you know, how, like you said, Gelly, really talking about justice, but justice for their descendants, for their children, being heard and feeling valued, and yes, reparations, just some type of compensation in some way, but more so just really, really feeling heard and respected is really a big deal.
I would say when the survivors were still living, the ones that I talked to,
yes,
them, the recognition was more important than money. Now, they're all in their 90s or 80s, 90s, or triple digits, and their point was, you know, money's not going to do me much good now.
Right.
But the recognition of what happened meant a lot to them.
Yes.
That makes sense to me. Maria, what was your takeaway from the film?
Oh, it just kind of enraged me, and I didn't like getting angry like that, but I just saw so many parallels from then and now, and I couldn't understand how that, for instance, that attorney that was talking about how the statute of limitations had gone by, and how it just reminded me of the policeman that had his knee in George Floyd's neck, as if nothing was going to happen to him, as if it didn't matter. And again, it's the same themes that we're discussing. And it just, so my takeaway was, what can we do to not let this happen again? What can we do to educate more people? How can we collaborate with levels of government and really, really inform people so that they really understand who they are? And as a country, where can we go if we all are on the same platform? So it was hard for me to watch. It really, really.
It is something difficult to deal with sometimes.
Randy, do you feel haunted the more information you have, the more information you gather? Is it empowering for you, or is it crippling? Like I imagine you must suffer a kind of PTSD looking into
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it's changed my perception of the past and the present and myself and other, it's changed just about every perception I have. But I wouldn't say it's PTSD. I mean, it's a learning experience. But sometimes, it gets, I would say the primary emotion that I felt as I went through it was anger.
Yes.
For several different reasons. I mean, and I guess the big one was it's just not right. Whatever that means, it's just not right. And but it also, you've learned, hey, a lot of this stuff, going back to what we learned in school, you find out, well, things weren't exactly like we learned in,
No, we weren't told the
social
truth.
studies.
Yes.
And so it was, I don't know if I would say disillusioning. Sometimes it was kind of disillusioning.
Did you have a moment where you had a reckoning moment where you really just couldn't believe through all the documents that you researched and discovered? Did you have one of those moments where?
I don't think I was smart enough to have that, because I'd have to go over all of this. I mean, some of this stuff I'd have to read it like 3 or 4 times before it's finally sunk in. Oh, this is what they're really saying. So all this stuff is in English, in 20th century English, and you'd think you'd read it and it'd be like the same as now, but it's not.
For example, Randy, what would you read and not?
Well, for one thing, they used a lot of euphemisms. Like the one that you hear about the most is assault. Like nowadays, I think we tend to think of assault as if, like I hit you in the mouth, but that's not what assault meant back then.
What did it mean?
It was rape or attempted rape.
Oh,
sexual assault. And so that's actually, what kind of got the whole thing started is that the newspaper said that Dick Rowland had been charged with assaulting or attempted assault on this white elevator operator. Well, that was read as rape, or attempted rape it would have been. And so, the Black Dispatch, which was a prominent newspaper in Oklahoma City, ran that story from the Tulsa Tribune under the headline, "The Story That Set Tulsa Ablaze." And it was a 5-paragraph story, and it's kind of a study in how, it's a study in how words matter and how language is used to prejudice people or to give it. So even though I'd worked at newspapers already for over 20 years when I started in this, it took me a while of reading that story for it to fully sink in what all was going on here. And it probably was not even done consciously by the reporter. He was just reflecting the language of the time. You know, I mean, that's just the way we talk about Black people, okay? Never used the N-word. It was nothing like that. But the story talks about, well, he was up on the, the 4th floor or the 3rd floor, and we're not really sure what he was doing up there. He was just kind of hanging around. And, and it referred to him as Diamond Dick. And there's no, there's no proof or indication that he ever referred to himself as that by that name. So in other words, the language sort of leads you to believe that, okay, this is kind of a ne'er-do-well Black guy who's hanging around looking for trouble. And here's this innocent, young white girl who initially was described as an orphan working her way through business college. It turned out she wasn't. So that kind of stuff.
That kind of language, the way Trump uses language today.
That's part of it. And then part of it was the newspapers often did not want to come out and, I guess what I'd say is they describe things the way, let's say two old friends are talking and they're talking about somebody and, they know each other. So they don't go back and say, well, Joe Smith was born in. It's like walking in on the middle of a conversation and you got to figure out what it is they're actually talking about. So it was very confusing because they had two committees that were appointed to handle the reconstruction. And it took me a while to figure out what that was all about. And it had to do with the fact that the Chamber of Commerce was angry with the city for allowing this to happen. And basically the Chamber of Commerce took over operation of the city for about 2 or 3 weeks.
Wow.
And then the city commission came back and took control back and fired this first committee that had actually been trying to raise money to rebuild Greenwood. And I would say, this is, but I know we're probably out of time and running out.
Yes, we are, unfortunately.
One point I'd like to make is that this is an example of what happens when you don't settle these things
when they
happen. Because if this had been settled at the time, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
No.
If the people of Greenwood had been treated properly in the 100 years since then, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because again,
someone did the elevator operator agree with the allegations or was that irrelevant?
Apparently she initially gave a statement to the police. She left town immediately on June 1st, when all this started. She eventually wrote a letter to the county attorney and asked him to drop the charges.
This is like Emmett Till.
Completely.
The woman who accused him of whistling at him.
No, it's very similar. It's very similar. And of course, nothing actually happened. One of the interesting things about this is it's not actually clear that there was a big move. In fact, it appears there was not really a concerted effort to get at Dick Rowland. And once the shooting started, he was probably the safest guy in town because he was in the jail on the top floor of the courthouse with 8 deputies guarding him and, all the doors barricaded and all of that stuff. And when the shooting started, everybody forgot about Dick Rowland. That
was
Can you imagine the terror he felt? If you grow up in a paradigm where you don't see the police as your protectors, being in a jail cell surrounded by 8 police officers where anything can happen to you and it's their word against yours. And you live in a culture where some people walk through life with the presumption of innocence and others walk through with the presumption of guilt. So not only might your life be snuffed out in a moment, but the whole story of what happened will be told by the perpetrators of a horrible crime.
Right, and that's one of the things that hasn't changed all that much.
At all.
Say this. Now, I will say this: the sheriff seems to have been generally committed to protecting Dick Rowland, but the danger was real. I mean, those guys that armed themselves and went to the courthouse would not have done that if they didn't think the danger to Dick Rowland was real. And again, that comes down to trust, not having a relationship.
Or the lack of, yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That there was no trust of the authorities. The authorities did not take control of the situation. I mean, today we talk about over militarized police and things like that, and rightly so. But at that time, the problem was the opposite. They didn't have much in the way of professional police. They didn't have very many of them. They weren't well trained. They weren't well equipped. They actually had to go to one of the oil companies to get guns, and they had to rely on the private citizens' cars to get from one place to another. And so, today in a situation like that, we'd have all sorts of police, law enforcement, National Guard, everything surrounding that courthouse, And back then it was the white sheriff and the black deputy out on the courthouse steps trying to get everybody to go home.
Wow.
And then you don't know if your white sheriff is moonlighting as a Klansman or maybe the Grand Wizard.
Were they Klansmen then in Oklahoma, or were they just a white mob?
Well, at the time of the massacre, there had not been a public appearance of the Klan. They in Tulsa, they like to come in with the big parades and all of that stuff. And Scott Ellsworth, who was one of the first people to write about this, said the Klan didn't make the riot made the Klan. I think there's some, and I would take that a little step further, and I would say the Klan didn't invent racism invented the Klan. I think there were probably some organizing going on. It wasn't fully formed. But the important thing is that you had an attitude that was not only racist, but we had a history of vigilantism in the city that went back to at least to World War I, when you had these home guards they were called, and these were all over the country, and they'd go in and they give you trouble if you weren't buying enough Liberty bonds or whatever, or if they didn't think they thought you talked funny. They in Tulsa, they had a detention center for women who were thought to be a little too single, if you know what I mean. And so all of this stuff.
Wait, Randy, what does that mean? That went right over my head, a little too single.
Okay, so what happened? So what happened during World War I is that they discovered, when they started drafting all these guys into the army, they discovered that a large share of the population had venereal disease, and so there was a sudden. Tulsa had a legal red light district until World War I. But when they discovered that this was going on, then there was a real crackdown on prostitution. And so basically unescorted, or I shouldn't say unescorted, but single women who couldn't, give an accounting for themselves were considered to be a public health hazard, and they were locked up in this. And so I bring all this
break.
Yeah, so we had this high moral tone of, and all of this stuff was done under in the book I talk quite a bit about the sermons that the white preachers gave the Sunday after the riot, and they were all assuming this attitude that the white people are responsible because we didn't have a heavy enough hand on controlling our Black people. And we all know that this was really so it was that kind of thing. And so you'd ask about the Ku Klux Klan, and I'm sorry, I kind of got off, but my point was that I was trying to illustrate here is that it almost doesn't matter if the Ku Klux Klan was there. I mean, the only thing that an organized Ku Klux Klan would have contributed was organization, because all the other ingredients were there. And, you know, the Ku Klux Klan is kind, I mean, there was in the United States, there was something called the Ku Klux Klan Knights of the Invisible Empire.
Oh, wow.
And it was kind of a multi-level marketing scheme, actually. It was run out of Atlanta, by the way.
Oh, wow.
But then you had all these other sort of unofficial, you know, who sort of copied them.
We've been going for a while, and we have to end our very powerful talk back. Randy Crable, thank you so much for your time. Gail.
Thanks for asking me. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, didn't we have a very special, hopefully the audience enjoyed it a lot. Hopefully more people are more informed about who we are as a country, who we are as a people, as Americans.
Well,
but I like
countries are like people, you know, they have personalities, and they have good and bad, and I think we need to know the good and bad.
I think we need to know all of it. The truth, please. Randy's book is Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre. Very special read, important to do so. Thank you so much, Teaneck International Film Festival. Tomorrow, Mama Gloria at 7 o'clock, and you can buy tickets 1 hour before. Thank you all so much for your time, Gail, Randy. This was good.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Maria. Nice to meet you, Randy.
It's nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
I hope you guys survive down there in Georgia in the next 2 months or whatever it is before your next election.
Blue wave is gaining strength.
Stacey Abrams is working it, huh, Gail?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Teaneck International Film Festival, for this very important film. I'm Maria Trice Jenkins. Thank you so much. Good night.